Hello, my name is Dr. Ken Reimer. I'm an assistant professor in the Faculty of Education at the University of Winnipeg. The title of my presentation topic today is Positive Teacher-Student Relationships, Best Practices from Canadian Elementary, Middle School, and High School Teachers. The purpose of this presentation is to discuss three studies that I've conducted beginning in 2014 that examined the recipe or the formula for what makes for good, positive teacher-student connections. It seems to me, when looking at the literature, that making positive connections is a vital component of school success for school children. And whether or not they make these positive connections with their teachers in schools can be a critical component of having academic and social emotional success in the school. Because students who are connected both interpersonally and institutionally at all levels, from kindergarten to grade 12, generally seem to have higher grades and graduation rates. So one thing that I would like to say here today is that I did three studies. The first study I did in 2014, and this was a study that sought out Manitoba high school classroom teachers. In fact, I had 9 teachers who signed up for the study, and I invited them to participate in a think tank-like focus group. And it was designed to better understand what they believed that they did to successfully connect with young people in school. In 2018, I replicated the study with elementary classroom teachers. I had 8 teachers participate in those focus groups. And again, I just completed about a month ago in 2022, the same study I replicated, but this time with middle school teachers. Unfortunately, due to COVID, I couldn't get the numbers of participants up to the numbers I had in previous studies. And so I managed to get 4 participants for that middle school study. Before I go any further and talk a little more detail about the studies that I did, I just want to share with you 3 symbols, okay? The first one on the left that you can see is a bandage. And underneath that, you've got the words incentives and authenticity. If you, for whatever reason, don't listen to the rest of my study or you can't remember all the details that I provide, I want you to remember the symbol for high school as being a bandage. And the key words that you need in order to successfully connect with students would be incentives and authenticity. The middle picture that you see, the middle symbol, is a log cabin that's lit up, looks pretty cozy, and it's found in the middle of the woods surrounded by a blizzard or a snowstorm. And the word underneath there is kusli, which is Norwegian for cozy. And I want you to remember that for elementary teachers, the symbol that I'd like you to remember is that your classroom is like a little warm log cabin that sometimes can be found in the middle of a blizzard. And your job is to make that classroom cozy or kushli. The final picture on the right is a picture of a rose. And underneath that is the word ephemeral, which means temporary or fleeting or very short-lived. And I use the picture of the rose, and I'll discuss it a little further later on, because it really symbolizes the relationship in the story The Little Prince and the Little Prince and it had with the rose, that despite the rose being very dramatic and at times could be very demanding at times and could be very difficult, it only blooms for a very short time. And the prince really loved this rose. And although it sometimes we found it difficult to imagine why you could love such a demanding creature as the rose, it is this love that made all the difference. And so these are my 3 symbols. On the left, the bandage for high school. In the middle, the cozy log cabin for elementary school. And on the right, for middle school, you'll find the rose. So when I did my 3 studies, the first study I did was in 2014 with 9 high school teachers. And I wanted to find out what is it that these teachers did in order to connect with high school students. And I found that there were 3 key components. Number 1, high school teachers did what they could to find similarities and shared interests between themselves and the students. And they talked about a variety of similarities and shared interests. For example, if teachers had a similar culture or language to some of the students they were teaching, they found that this was a great connecting tool. Hobbies, music, television, pop culture, things of that nature. These were also really good avenues to connect with students that they were teaching. Current events was really important. And finally, social issues. These were really, really important things to discuss with students, and it seemed to provide a good mechanism to connect with them, and successful connection. Secondly, teachers talked about providing incentives in terms of helping students with their needs and their wants. There were many students, particularly struggling students or students who could be deemed as being at risk of dropping out of school, and they required consistent academic and social assistance. And teachers in this study talked about how critical it was for them to help students with their needs and their wants that extended beyond the classroom and maybe curricular activities. So things like math help or ELA help or opening their room at lunch or after school were important. Also having food available for kids. Once a teacher talked about baking 2 loaves of bread every day for his morning class, and this would ensure a lot of students showing up on time. In fact, they would show up early because they wanted to get the first slice of bread. Loaning out money, microloans, was also a component of connecting with students and providing them with some of their social needs. And so not just coaching teams, but also creating clubs or areas of interest where kids could gather together, make some friends, connect socially on perhaps maybe a similar topic of an important subject. And finally, being viewed as authentic. This was very critical, that teachers felt that they needed to be viewed as someone who sincerely cared about the kids, that was legitimate in their eyes, that could be transparent, that would give the kid a voice. And so teachers said that being viewed as authentic was very, very important. And this is very interesting. If you look at the research, Bourdieu talks about, from an economic perspective, talks about the importance of capital in everyone's lives. And that is, all people have capital, including our students. But capital isn't just money and stuff. It's more than that. So it's more than just economic capital, but there is also cultural capital. This is what you know, what you learn in school, what you learn from your home. This is important. There's also social capital, and this is who you know and the importance of this. And Bourdieu talks about the fact that, social capital, cultural capital can be converted into economic capital. And it can also be inherited. And so teachers talked about incentives being economic, moral, social, but areas in which they provided different forms of capital to students, and that students would be drawn to this, and this would further enhance and make successful connections with their teachers. And so combined with these incentives is authenticity. Gladwell calls this legitimacy and says that if you want to have the principle of legitimacy, it means that students have to have a voice, and the teacher must be viewed as predictable and fair, consistent, if you will. Now, authenticity, legitimacy are both good words. I think one word that kind of summarizes both of them would be sincere. The teacher is viewed as sincerely caring and having the best interests of the students in mind, according to the students. And so a bit of a formula for recipe for success would be an economic response of providing economic, social, and moral incentives combined with the principle of legitimacy might make for successful connections with students. A simpler way to say this, a simpler recommendation, is if you want to make positive teacher-student connections at the high school level, it is a combination, it seems to me, of incentives plus authenticity. Now, this is a big challenge for high school teachers, because in Manitoba, most teachers are contractually obligated to be present at work for about 6.5 hours a day. And within that, they get a lunch period. And then, there's some time in between classes where people move around. So at the end of the day, there seems to be about 300 minutes a day for teachers to teach their subjects and connect with their students. 300 minutes a day. If a teacher teaches 4 classes a day and they average about 25 students per class, that means that they see about 100 students per day. 300 minutes of teaching and contact time divided by that 100 minutes really means that teachers have about 3 minutes a day per high school student to make a successful connection for teachers. And this can be an overwhelming and very, very daunting chapter. And that is why I used the symbol of the bandage. And, one of the things that I think is we hear oftentimes in school and all sorts of social institutions and services is the idea of a Band-Aid solution, and this is frowned upon generally. People say, look, I have an idea for this, and someone says, well, so that's just a Band-Aid solution. We need to come up with a more deeper, get to the roots of the problem solution. We can't just put a Band-Aid on everything. Gladwell, again, to quote him, talks about the fact that in reality, bandages are often overlooked and greatly underappreciated because they might, in fact, be the most significant medical technology in the history of humankind. You think about it. If I'm working at a restaurant and I cut my finger while I'm preparing some food to be served, I could either go home and lose a day's pay, food will not be served, or I could put a bandage on my wound and I could get through my shift before I could take greater care of that wound later on, perhaps, or not. At least it would be covered and protected. If I want to play tennis with some friends and I get a blister, we could either stop the game entirely, I could tend to my blister, it could pop open and we would have no game, or I could put a bandage on this wound, this blister, and we could continue to play. And oftentimes, students at the high school level will come to school with wounds that have been there a long time. They have been there since early childhood. And simply the time that classroom teachers are afforded to try and tend to all of these wounds, there just isn't enough time. And sometimes what teachers have to do through incentives and authenticity is apply the bandage. And this is actually could be considered a best practice. And so please don't overlook this analogy or this symbol. Now, in 2018, I decided to replicate this study as a faculty member at the University of Winnipeg, and so I did it, but this time with elementary school teachers. I brought 8 elementary school teachers together, and I said, look, what do you do to connect with your teachers or with your students? And I want to look for similarities, and I want to look for differences between the study I did with high school. And I found that in the literature, strong relationships with teachers is especially critical for children when they first enter the school system. It might be the most important time for positive teacher-student relationships to occur, because even though they benefit students of all ages, they really benefit the young children. And I found 4 different ways that teachers connected with students when I asked the teachers. First, they always attempted to meet the student needs, and each teacher spoke of the monumental number of needs that young learners need to do as they first enter school, in their first few years of school. They have a lot of needs, and teachers did whatever they could to meet them. Secondly, they felt that this was a chance to give students voice. Teachers, in order to connect with students, needed to empower students to express themselves and discover their own interests. And even though they may not be able to write these ideas down because students don't have the ability to print yet when they first enter school, many students don't, they would even act as their scribe and write stories together. But empowering students to express themselves, discover their own interests was very, very important. Incorporate what they've learned from students into their daily interactions with curriculum. So if a student was fascinated with space or volcanoes or whales or Dr. Seuss, then teachers did what they could to try and incorporate that into their curricular lessons in the school, because they felt that if students could connect themselves with the curriculum, then there was a better opportunity for teacher-student connection as well. And finally, teachers spoke about creating opportunities for shared experiences. And so Harari talks about this, about creating collective experiences, I believe it is. But I'm talking about shared experience. So teachers and students would read books together. They would play together. They would create stories together. They would act together. They would do all sorts of things. Teachers talked about getting down on the floor and being at the kids' levels rather than being an adult looking down at the kids and the kids always looking up. But creating any opportunity for shared experience. One teacher spoke about how they went outside at recess and played with the kids, and that made all the difference in connecting. They'd go in the sandbox. They'd play in soccer games. They'd even play, hide and seek with the kids. All of these things created opportunities for shared experiences. And so this created the big theme. And I've got a picture here, a home away from home. Really, participants in this study did whatever they could to connect with their students like caring family members, because they saw great benefits in connecting with the student, but not just the student, the entire home. Elementary teachers in this study stated that connecting with siblings, connecting with parents was really, really important in order for them to connect with their students. They wanted students to come into their classroom and feel like their classroom was a home away from home, and that their classroom was like a family. One teacher talked about the idea of creating word walls. And so they spoke of the fact that on the first day of school, each student's name would be printed and posted on the walls of the classroom, so each student could find their name. And so it was like as if they were there. One teacher talked about grandma brag books. And what this was teachers would take photographs constantly of the kids in action, doing things in the classroom, doing things together. And at the end of the year, they would collect these and put them into a bit of a book. And so the student could look at the book and see all the things that they did, a bit of an informal yearbook, and all the activities and things, kind of like as they compared it to, the teachers compared it to like a grandmother having a photo album of pictures of their grandkids, and the teachers want to do this. One of the components that a teacher talked about that I thought was quite important was they talked about the importance of touch, and teachers want to talk about this, that this was really, really important, that touch was important. While teachers all acknowledge you have to be very appropriate and careful with this, they spoke about the fact that these kids will sometimes run into the classroom and hug them, and they felt the need to hug them back. Sometimes they wanted to just be reassured and have our arm around them and said that everything's going to be okay, like they would do as if they were a mom to their own children, as one teacher said. Sometimes kids need it. And one of the stories that was shared really connected with a Canadian audience, because it can get very cold here. And this was the wearing your mitts. One teacher described that there was a little girl who was having some home issues, a lot of home issues, and she would come to school, and one of the problems was at morning recess, when it's very cold and wintry and snowy outside, the student would go outside with mitts and always come back forgetting their mitts, and their hands would be raw and cold and red. And every day the teacher had to rub the hands and a little bit remind the student very firmly that they couldn't keep losing their mitts because they were freezing their hands. And no matter what the teacher reminded the student of, the student continued to lose her mitts. And so one day, as the teacher expressed frustration about this to a colleague, the colleague said, you know what, I noticed that what this little girl does every day just before we come in at recess, the girl intentionally takes off her mitts and intentionally puts her hands in the snow, and then comes running inside, because every day she wants that teacher to just grab her hands and rub her hands and warm her up. And so teachers talked about the importance of touch. I spoke a little bit about connecting with the family. That means parents, that means siblings of the children. Some teachers expressed that, you know what, if I'm teaching this child, I'll probably teach the younger sibling in 2 years. And so if I'm going on a field trip and I'm bringing my class, why not invite the parents, and why not invite that younger sibling, preschool child, to come and join along, so that on that child's first day of school, they've already known that teacher for a couple of years. I thought this was really a great job of getting ahead of things. And so, because families are so complex, because teachers acknowledge that home life can be very complicated, because oftentimes students don't know where their parents are. Sometimes there are children who are in care and have a social worker, have a classroom teacher, have parents, have biological parents, have foster parents, have so many different parts in their lives, that the one thing they can do is their classroom can be viewed as a cozy log cabin, or the term kushli, which means cozy, make their classroom very kushli. This is very, very important for teachers, and they all seem to share something that described a kushli classroom. They said that oftentimes, because there was no one magic solution to connecting with kids, they provided examples of how they had classrooms adorned with cozy carpets, photographs of classmates, inviting play areas. Even sometimes teachers talked about sneaking in their pet dog for the classroom on a Friday, because they wanted their classroom to feel like a cozy home away from home, and they wanted their classroom to be viewed as a group of caring family members. Oops. And this is interesting because I found that the one term that seemed to connect this is the term couche, which means cozy, and couchely, which means a certain feeling that you can use that evokes warm and fuzzy feelings. Teachers said that for many children, their life outside of the classroom, outside of the school day, feels like wandering through a blizzard. You just can't see where your next step is going. There is no consistency. And so one thing that the teachers say, that even if kids spend their nights and day, out there in that blizzard, when they come into the classroom, it feels like a cozy log cabin. There's something to eat. They're warmly greeted. It's nice and warm. There's a book that we can read together. There's some interesting stuff we can do in the corner together. And at the end of the day, we bundle that kid up and we send them on their way. Not every kid goes outside to a blizzard, but especially for the kids who do, this is absolutely critical. And so do what you can for elementary teachers to make your classroom feel cozy or couchely. The other thing that I just want to share is the importance of routine and rhythm. Teachers spoke about this. Oftentimes routine, structure, order can sometimes be met skeptically, that we want kids to go out and simply find their way throughout the day and experience learning on their own terms. In fact, elementary teachers said that one of the ways to connect with students, because life cannot be very consistent outside of the classroom for many kids, is to ensure consistency in the classroom. This was critical for elementary teachers. And so teacher-initiated routines that were, as Garrett says, student-centered, are instrumental in creating an optimal rhythm for learning and also for teacher-student connections. And so they spoke about the fact that whatever you can do to bring in student-centered routines is great for creating a rhythm in the classroom. And so I just thought that I would share that with you because it seemed to be an important part. Don't forget rhythm or routine to the classroom. My final thing that I want to talk about today is my study that I just completed about a month ago, that I'm just in the midst of writing up and doing further research on. And this is teacher-student connections in the middle school. From a Canadian context, this would generally mean students in grade 5 through grade 8. Although sometimes with the schools, they only have grade 6 to 8. Sometimes there are grade 6 to grade 9. But in most cases, middle school here from a Canadian context means grades 5 to 8. And here are some early thoughts based on interviews, based on the focus group, the think tanks that I did with 4 middle school teachers. Here are the insights that I have collected that I'm still trying to sort through, but let me share with you some early thoughts on this study. First, I used the term stuck in the middle with you. It seems key for me, and for any of you school administrators, school principals out there, it seems really, really critical that if you are in a middle school, find teachers who especially want to teach in a middle school. This is absolutely critical. You want to have teachers that can think of no other place they'd rather be than with middle school teachers, with middle school students, because middle school students can be a very difficult and unique group of students to work with. And it's not for everybody. And so you want to find teachers who, more than anything else, want to connect with that wonderful group of middle school students. Secondly, as one teacher said, look, you got to be explicit in your language when you're working with middle school teachers. And so in the conversations that I had with the participants in the study, many of them shared that when you're trying to connect with the student, be intentional. Tell them exactly what you're doing. They may not realize what you're doing. So say to a student, hey, I really like your jacket. You know, I'm really trying to connect with you. You seem like a really interesting kid, and I'm trying to connect with you. Be intentional. Be explicit with your language of what you're doing. They may not recognize or realize what you're doing. Give them the opportunity to connect with you because you're being clear to them that you are open to making a positive teacher-student connection with them. Number 3 is find middle ground. You have to recognize that students in middle school are constantly have one foot in the world of the child and one foot in the world of the teenagers. And some days, maybe from 9 to 10 in the morning, Both feet are in the world of a child. And by 2 in the afternoon, they're trying to put both feet in the world of a teenager or even a young adult. They're going to constantly be fluctuating between these worlds. They live a very, it's very fluid between the worlds that they travel to. And so the time they spend between these two worlds is very short, but this is really critical from a developmental standpoint. This time when they travel between these two planets of the child and of the teenager. In this case, you as the teacher need to be the constant. You need to be on firm ground and allow them to float between these worlds or planets. The final thing is discovery. Middle school students want to learn about themselves and connect with themselves and figure out who they are. This can be referred to as introspection, but they also want to connect with everything that's going on in the outside world. They want to learn about what is going on out there beyond themselves. This is extrospection. Your job is to act as their guide through this as they learn to connect with themselves and connect with the outside world. Act as their guide. And so the symbol that I use comes from the story The Little Prince. It's a short read if you haven't read. It's very popular. It's been published in many, many languages, more than I can count right now. And there's this particular poignant scene between the little prince who goes from planet to planet. But on his home planet, he makes this great connection, has this relationship with the one rose that lives on his planet. And the word that I use to describe middle school is same as the word that I use to describe how the little prince described the rose, and that is ephemeral. And ephemeral means very short, fleeting, temporary. The time that a rose blooms is very short and fleeting and temporary, and often not recorded for historical purposes because it's not permanent like a mountain. And the prince spends much of his day caring for this rose, and the rose is really challenging. The rose is really demanding, and it only blooms for a very short while when the sun is up. But this time is absolutely critical. In fact, for the reader, we often read the story in this relationship between the little prince and the rose, and we go, how can the little prince possibly love and care for this rose when it's so demanding? And yet this little prince absolutely adores and loves this rose, and adores and loves taking care of this rose. Because if you love taking care of this rose as it learns how to bloom, as the fox describes later to the prince, that's what makes all the difference and gives meaning to life. And middle school students can be like the rose. They can be demanding, they can be challenging, they can bloom and be absolutely beautiful. And if you love and care for them, this is what can make all the difference. Listen, thank you for listening. If you don't remember all the details, I hope you remember the symbol of the bandage, the cozy log cabin in the blizzard, and the rose that blooms. Thank you very much. I wish you well. I hope we can connect soon and meet in person. Bye-bye.